It's a place of unrivaled riches, a land of 10,000 lakes, endless forests exploding with color, and astounding wealth buried deep underground. Minnesota. It's a state that holds a special place in the heart of the nation. It's here that the journey of one of America's mightiest rivers begins. A river whose power fueled an epic battle between two flower kings and gave rise to the now famous Twin Cities. But it was also in Minnesota where a devastating conflict raged across America's frontier before coming to a grisly end. Aerial Minnesota soars across blue Midwestern skies, where one young boy's dreams of flight inspired him to become an aviation legend, and where a second-generation daredevil still dazzles farmers today. In this bread and butter state, hard work and ingenuity have fed a growing nation for more than a century, and great cities of industry have given birth to artistic genius. Once this northern state was written off as America's Siberia, but today it explodes with life. This is Minnesota. There's no place in Minnesota more famous for its patchwork of cornfields, dairies, and quaint towns than this, Stearns County. Here, under big prairie skies, Minnesotans have earned a reputation for their friendliness, often referred to as Minnesota nice. And like a beacon on the prairie, the water tower of the town of Freeport cheerily welcomes visitors to stop in. In the 1970s, one of those visitors was the now beloved American storyteller, Garrison Keillor. It was here in Freeport that Keillor was inspired to create his own fictional Minnesota town, a place well known by his fans as Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. Keillor was a regular at Charlie's Cafe and the smoky dive bar, the Pioneer Inn. Here, he met the real characters that inspired the colorful fictional ones on his weekly radio series, A Prairie Home Companion. The cozy vibe of downtown Freeport can be traced back to the close-knit communities of the state's farming pioneers. In the mid-19th century, German and Scandinavian immigrants began pouring into Minnesota, chasing the promise of good farmland. Thousands of years ago, retreating glaciers deposited sediment that makes this some of the most fertile land in the world. Wheat and corn thrived here, and early pioneers quickly wrote home with word of their success. Soon, these European enclaves grew, holding tight to their old world traditions. And they left their stamp on the landscape with distinctive-looking barns. Today, 81,000 farms cover half of the state of Minnesota, producing $16 billion worth of cash crops each year. Minnesotan farmers are known for their work ethic, but sometimes they get a break. Long before Garrison Keillor was entertaining the world with stories of the state's farm town locals, other entertainers were arriving out of the sky. Daredevil pilots known as barnstormers, who still dazzle Minnesota farmers today. pilot John Moore lifts off in his blue and gold Stearman biplane, just like the one his grandfather flew back in the 1920s. After World War I, many pilots got their hands on surplus planes like these and began flying them from town to town to entertain the locals. And Minnesota's farmers didn't even have to leave home to catch a show. The barnstormers came to them in the form of full-blown aerobatic spectacles. Pilots used farmers' fields as makeshift runways, and huge crowds gathered to watch their death-defying stunts. Moore got hooked on flying at an early age, much like another young Minnesotan who would go on to become one of the most famous aviators of the 20th century. Charles Lindbergh's dreams of flight began here, along the Mississippi River. He spent much of his childhood at a small farmhouse that's now hidden in the trees near the town of Little Falls. Here, an airplane captured his imagination for the first time. I heard an unusually loud engine noise. I ran to the window and climbed out onto the roof. There was an airplane flying upriver, below the treetops on the banks. Of course, I wanted to fly in it, but my mother said it would be much too expensive and dangerous. Luckily, the young Lindbergh didn't let his mother's warning deter him. In college, he quickly learned to fly, and the rest is aviation history. Perhaps it was the endless horizons of the Minnesota plains that lured Lindbergh into the air. He later wrote of the thrill of his first flight, seeing cows become the size of rabbits and barns that soon looked like toys. But even from high above, some Minnesotan landmarks remain larger than life. This German chieftain, who once battled the Roman army, stands watch over the town of New Ulm in the Minnesota River Valley. Standing 32 feet tall, Hermann the German peers down on a town that looks like it could be in southern Germany. That's because back in the 1850s, the German founders of New Ulm set out to create a haven for their own culture and traditions. Even these days, polka music often fills the streets and glockenspiel bells ring on the hour. Many of the town's most important buildings are German-inspired, from the brick clock tower of its cathedral to one of the most unique-looking former post offices in America. But New Ulm may be best known for this brick factory, built in 1860 by a young machinist named August Schell, who wanted to bring good German beer to his growing town. He built his brewery next to Cottonwood River to easily transport beer, supplies, and giant blocks of ice for refrigeration. As Schell's brewery grew, so too did New Ulm. It was not long before there were 38 saloons in town, one for every 200 citizens. Today, Schell's brews are still considered some of the best in the country. At the time, the brewery and New Ulm sat smack in the middle of Dakota Sioux land, the easternmost territory of the Sioux people. When the Dakota Sioux came to town to trade, Mrs. Schell often gave them food. That's because times were tough for members of the tribe, and only getting tougher as settlers and the U.S. government started pushing them off their land. Tensions that would soon explode in one of the bloodiest conflicts in Minnesota history. On the far western edge of the state, a mile-long fissure cuts through the landscape. This ribbon of red rock marks one of the last Native American territories in Minnesota to be settled by Europeans. These are the sacred pipestone quarries of the Dakota Sioux, now part of the Pipestone National Monument. For at least 3,000 years, members of the tribe extracted soft rock here to carve their ceremonial pipes, believing the blood of their ancestors lay within it. Like pipestone, much of Minnesota itself was once Dakota Sioux territory. But in the first half of the 19th century, the U.S. government started pressuring the tribe to sell their land. In a treaty signed in 1851, the Dakota Sioux traded half of Minnesota for the promise of supplies, education, and gold. But the U.S. soon broke that treaty when it defaulted on its payments. After a series of bad harvests, the Dakota Sioux were pushed to their breaking point. In August 1862, small bands of Dakota warriors began launching raids on the northern fringe of their reservation, which bordered the Minnesota River. They attacked farms and villages, killing hundreds of settlers and taking women and children hostage. One of the fiercest battles was fought at New Ulm. 650 Dakota lit fires to houses on the edges of town, corralling settlers into a 4-block square downtown. Outnumbered, New Ulm's 300 defenders began burning down much of their own town in an effort to fend off the attack. When the battle ended, New Ulm lay in ruins. Except for Shell's Brewery, high above the Cottonwood River. Many believe it was spared during the battle because of the Shell's kindness to the Dakota. The U.S.-Dakota conflict of 1862 was one of the largest attacks on settlers in U.S. history. After 6 weeks of bitter fighting, 400 civilians and U.S. soldiers, as well as countless Dakota Sioux, were dead. In late September, the Dakota Sioux finally surrendered, and U.S. soldiers took more than 1,000 members of the tribe captive. But the grisly end of the war was still to come. It happened here in the town of Mankato, on the banks of the Minnesota River. At Reconciliation Park, on Mankato's waterfront, stands a white buffalo. Sculpted from a 67-ton block of Minnesota limestone, it marks an execution site. On the morning of December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota prisoners were marched to a makeshift scaffolding here on the edge of town. A crowd of nearly 4,000 citizens had gathered to see justice served. 303 Dakota had originally been sentenced to die, but President Lincoln spared 265 of them, reserving execution for the 38 men accused of killing and assaulting civilians. To keep order among the crowd, more than 1,000 soldiers were at the ready. As the prisoners filed towards their death, and as the nooses were tied around their necks, they sang a Dakota song. Then, with a swift blow of a soldier's axe, the floor below them fell away, and 38 members of the Dakota Sioux were executed all at once. It would be the single largest mass execution in U.S. history. Surviving members of the tribe were interned at nearby Fort Snelling, where many died from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The following year, in 1863, 6,000 Dakota people were forced to relocate to South Dakota and Nebraska. With the Dakota gone, settlers moved in, paving the way for rapid growth, booming industries, and big cities that followed. But the legacy of the state's native tribe lives on. The name Minnesota itself is a Dakota Sioux word that means sky-tinted water. In this state, water can often appear to be everywhere. And without its most famous waterway, Minnesota's Twin Cities would never have existed. In late October, thousands of Canadian geese traveling south for the winter cross Minnesota. Their flocks can be up to 100,000 strong. Many stop to rest and refuel at a place called Lac-La-Parle Lake, a French translation of the original Dakota name that means lake that speaks. Spend 5 minutes here, and it's not hard to see and hear why. Their cacophony of honks and quacks will soon follow many of them south to Mexico. Minnesota may be known as the land of 10,000 lakes, but in typical Minnesotan fashion, that's a polite understatement. 15,000 is probably more like it. From the air, it looks like one could puddle jump right across the state. Thousands of years ago, a massive glacial ice sheet slid across this land, churning up the earth and leaving potholes behind to fill with meltwater. One of these unassuming bodies of water has played an important role in the history of the nation. In 1832, an explorer named Henry Rowe Schoolcraft arrived here on his search for the mysterious source of one of America's greatest rivers, the Mississippi. With the help of a local Ojibwe guide, Schoolcraft finally found what he was looking for. He named this lake Itasca, a mashup of two Latin words meaning true head. Every year, 500,000 people flock here to witness the humble beginnings of the mighty Mississippi. It's the only place where it's possible to wade across North America's biggest river on foot. From here, the river quickly grows in size and strength as it winds its way south over 2,500 miles to the Gulf of Mexico. In Minnesota, one spot on this historic waterway holds particular significance: the place where the Mississippi River meets the Minnesota. Today, this confluence is home to the twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Back in the 1800s, it was the intersection of two main highways on the beaver fur trade, which made it a popular camp for the traders. One, named Pierre Perrant, or Pig's Eye, thanks to his one squinty eye, became particularly well known, not for his hunting skills, but for his whiskey. In a cave, a short paddle away from where the rivers meet, Pig's Eye set up a ramshackle saloon, which quickly became a popular hangout. When squatters around Fort Snelling were kicked out in 1838, many settled down around Pig's Eye's bar. It was great for business until a zealous Catholic father came to town in 1841. He built a simple log chapel of St. Paul to minister to the Pig's Eye settlers. By 1860, Pig's Eye was known as St. Paul's Landing and had become the territorial capital. Few state capitals can claim such bawdy beginnings as St. Paul, Minnesota. The St. Paul congregation has since moved on from its first rustic gathering spot on the river cliffs. These days, members of the church gather in this majestic granite building, topped with a massive copper dome. From its high perch, the silhouette of their Cathedral of St. Paul has defined the city's skyline ever since it was completed in 1915. By then, another domed beauty just down the road had already opened its doors: Minnesota's new state capitol building. Its ornate facade, completed in 1905, was chiseled out of sparkling white Georgian marble. To this day, it's considered one of the country's grandest public buildings. But in spite of its polished appearance, St. Paul has attracted its fair share of colorful characters, in keeping with the spirit of the city's founder. On this quiet tree-lined street is the childhood home of one of the most celebrated American writers of the 20th century, F. Scott Fitzgerald. When Fitzgerald moved back to St. Paul as an adult, he earned a reputation for his hard drinking and racy lifestyle, not unlike the jazz-age characters he created. And if it weren't for the mighty Mississippi River, Fitzgerald's St. Paul might have only been mere fiction. In the late 1800s, this was one of the busiest river ports in America. Each year, boats delivered tens of thousands of German and Irish immigrants here from the big cities downriver, St. Louis and New Orleans. But this was the end of the line. Further upstream lay unnavigable rapids and a turbulent cascade called St. Anthony Falls. The falls may have cut off steamboat transit, but their power fueled an economic boom that laid the foundation for an entirely new city, St. Paul's bigger, more influential twin. The story of how the twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis turned into powerhouses on the American prairie begins in the 1820s, when a few enterprising businessmen first molded these falls into a source of hydropower, for their new mills. When railroads came to town in the second half of the 19th century, those mills kicked into high gear. Trains packed with Minnesota grain steamed into town across the then brand new Stone Arch Bridge. Today, it's a favorite among the city's pedestrians, but it was once the emblem of the railroad age and part of the Great Northern Railway, a network of rail lines that stretched from St. Paul to Seattle. Thanks to the trains, there was no end to the amount of grain that could be turned to flour. Minneapolis was soon known across the nation as Mill City, the flour milling capital of the world. In 1880, the Washburn A mill was able to grind enough gold medal flour to bake 12 million loaves of bread a day. It was the biggest mill in the world at the time, at least for a while. Soon, others were competing to become flour kings. After planning in secret for 5 years, a man named Charles Pillsbury built the most advanced flour mill in the world. His colossal red tile grain elevator remains one of Minneapolis's most distinctive industrial structures. Behind these brick walls, powerful water wheels allowed the mill to pump out 5,000 barrels a day, at a time when others were yielding just 500. It was a flour arms race. But in the end, Pillsbury's output was surpassed by that of his biggest rivals. In 1928, the makers of gold medal flour merged with 5 other nearby mills, and General Mills was born. Today, this food conglomerate controls over 100 global brands, including Betty Crocker, Cheerios, Yoplait, and Haagen-Dazs. One of the 5 biggest food companies in the world, General Mills still calls Minneapolis home. Many early edifices of the flour industry are still standing, like the burnt-out skeleton of the Washburn A mill, which now houses the Mill City Museum. Next door, the futuristic cantilevered bridge of the Guthrie Theater juts out over the Mississippi River. It's the centerpiece of a vibrant new arts district and an example of how the city's industrial past has paved the way for its more artsy future. Known today as the Mini-Apple, Minneapolis has more theater seats per capita than anywhere else in the country, outside of New York. Art is a big deal here, often quite literally. Take, for example, the oversized Spoon Bridge in Cherry, sculpted by Klaas Oldenburg and Kosha van Bruggen. Its 1,200-pound cherry and 5,800-pound spoon are so big, they had to be built in 2 different New England shipyards and then transported here and assembled on site. They now sit in one of the largest urban sculpture gardens in the country. It's part of the Walker Art Center, a gallery that got its start in 1879, when lumber baron Thomas B. Walker hung his favorite paintings in a room in his house and welcomed anyone who wanted to see them. 135 years later, the Walker Art Center is considered one of the most popular modern art museums in the country. But it's another museum that best captures the split personality of the Twin Cities. At the University of Minnesota campus, the Weissman Art Museum's more traditional side is now eclipsed by its more avant-garde. The ultra-modern brushed steel design by architect Frank Gehry also symbolizes Minneapolis's new era of innovative industry and business growth. And when it comes to dominating the skyline, the city's 3 tallest skyscrapers have had their fair share of sibling rivalry. When the sleek, dark IDS Center, designed by Philip Johnson, was completed in 1973, it quickly dominated the skyline at 775 feet tall. 15 years later, the gleaming Art Deco Wells Fargo building shot up nearby, but its highest features topped out at 774 feet. But in 1992, the steely new Capella Tower made a bid for the crown. Its builder claimed it was taller than the IDS by almost a foot. But now, counting a storage area for window washing equipment on its roof, the IDS is once again the tallest building in the state at 792 feet. 16 feet higher than the Capella. And it also has another claim to fame. This downtown office building was featured in the opening credits of The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Long before this recent growth spurt, Minnesota's tallest building was not in Minneapolis, but 80 miles south in the town of Rochester. The 19-story Plummer Building was also the headquarters of a radical new method of practicing medicine. Back in the 1880s, Dr. William Worrell Mayo and his two sons, Dr. Charlie and Dr. Will, opened up their small family practice to other doctors and local researchers. Their innovative teamwork approach to patient care became a model for hospitals around the world. Today, the Mayo Clinic is still considered a pioneer in the research and treatment of hard-to-treat diseases. From its towering skyscrapers and large-scale art to its cutting-edge medical facilities, this Midwestern state sets a high bar. But far outside of its twin cities lies what may be Minnesota's most treasured asset, a spectacular show put on every fall by Mother Nature. In October, the forests of northern Minnesota explode in color. Maples, oak, aspen, and tamaracks take center stage, blazing every imaginable shade of yellow, orange, and red. But this jaw-dropping display is a relatively recent phenomenon. Over a century ago, much of northern Minnesota was covered primarily with just one species, white pine. Today, they're hard to find. This tiny grove, known as the Lost 40, is one of the only patches of white pine remaining in the state. 98% of Minnesota's old-growth pine has been wiped off the map by the logging industry, clearing ground for a more diverse range of species that now blankets the state with fall colors. As frontier settlements grew across Minnesota in the early 19th century, the demand for timber skyrocketed. By the 1830s, these hills were starting to teem with lumberjacks. One still remains larger than life, especially in the lakeside town of Bemidji, where residents claim their folk hero, Paul Bunyan, was born. As legend has it, Paul cut straight across these forests with his trusty ox, Babe, who hauled off logs as fast as he could chop them. Here in Bemidji, Paul cast an impressive shadow at 18 feet tall. There's a lot of love in Minnesota's woods for Mr. Bunyan. That's because logging runs deep in the veins here. To the east, the lush St. Croix River Valley was once considered the mother lode of white pine. And it was the St. Croix River that runs through it, which turned the logging industry here into a national sensation. When U.S. treaties opened up Native American land in 1837, logging companies raced to stake claim on virgin white pine forests. The wood was strong, lightweight, and floated well downriver. During the winter, lumberjacks would drag logs over the frozen ground using horse and oxen, then float those logs downriver to sawmills in the spring. It was treacherous work. Brawny lumbermen, known as river pigs, had to steer and sometimes ride the logs downriver. Those who fell off could be crushed or drowned. Logs frequently choked up the St. Croix, and the river pigs had to muscle or dynamite them out of the jam. This is the site of one of the most notorious pileups in Minnesota's logging history. The Dalles is considered the sharpest and most dangerous bend on the river. When logs crammed into this deep basalt gorge in 1886, the blockage stretched back for 2 miles. The logs were so thick that a person could walk right across them. More than 200 river pigs labored for 6 weeks, using ropes, steam engines, and finally, 24 pounds of dynamite to blow through the jam. Once it was cleared, the logs floated downstream to a town aptly named Stillwater, thanks to the wide, quiet waters that flowed along its banks. It was a perfect place to gather the floating timber so it could be sent to Stillwater's mills. Stillwater started off in the 1840s as a tiny fur trading town on the St. Croix River, and it's considered the birthplace of the state. The first convention to establish Minnesota as a territory took place here in 1848. A decade later, Minnesota became the 32nd state. When the golden age of lumber arrived, Stillwater's fortunes quickly changed. By the 1890s, it was the busiest logging depot on the St. Croix. With as much as 450 million board feet of lumber and logs arriving here each year from upriver. At its peak, 13,000 people called it home. But Stillwater's boom didn't last long. By 1900, most of the trees worth logging were already gone, which caused its mills to close. Minnesota's white pine forests had vanished, and the great lumber boom came to an end. But luckily, the state had another treasure buried underground. One that would end up helping the country win 2 world wars. The story begins here in Minnesota's Iron Range, hills that the local Ojibwe called the Sleeping Giant. In the early 1880s, an industrialist from Pennsylvania named Charlemagne Tower woke these hills up from their slumber when he snatched up 20,000 acres here. A few years later, the Sudan mine was pulling up its first loads of ore. It's the deepest iron mine in Minnesota, plunging almost 2,500 feet. Once the ore was heaved up to the surface, trains lined up at this loading bridge to carry it off for processing. Those trains stopped running here in 1962, when the best of the mine's iron ore was finally gone. But mining still continues in Minnesota on a grand scale. Meet the man-made Grand Canyon of the North, otherwise known as Hull Rust Mahoney Mine. It's the largest open-pit iron mine on the Earth's surface, but some parts of this 3-by-2-mile pit look like another planet. During both world wars, 1/4 of all the iron ore in the U.S. came out of these red hills to make steel tanks and ships. Today, giant machines drill deep holes for explosives to blast the bedrock. Then, 33 cubic yard shovels extract the ore. Motorcades of 240-ton trucks then bring in the rock for processing, where it's crushed so the ore can be separated and shipped to steel mills. Since it opened in 1895, almost 1.5 billion tons of ore have been removed from this big hole, helping Minnesota become the largest producer of iron ore and lower-grade taconite in the country. On this outcrop of land at the edge of the mine lie faint traces of a ghost town the mine left in its wake. From the air, the abandoned streets and foundations of old Hibbing are still faintly visible. In the 1910s, the Oliver Mining Company realized the town was sitting on a gold mine of iron ore. And so, it convinced the town to pack up and move everything. Residents used horses, steel wheels, and logs to transport 180 houses and 20 businesses to a site 2 miles away. The move cost the mining company $16 million at the time, but considering the potential wealth of the mine, it was a small price to pay. New Hibbing went on to become the largest town in the Iron Range and one of the great melting pots of Minnesota. Since jobs were plentiful and English wasn't required, mining was a natural fit for immigrants. In the early 20th century, Swedes, Finns, Croatians, and Slovenians made up 70% of the mining force in the Iron Range. In the nearby town of Chisholm, this 36-foot-tall brass statue commemorates the miners who've been digging in these hills for more than 100 years. Life was made easier for many of them thanks to one local businessman. In 1914, Swedish immigrant Carl Wickham began offering rides to help Hibbing's miners get to work. Within 7 years, his sleek gray buses, known as Greyhounds, were taking them to cities across Minnesota. Some of these early workhorses now rest here in Hibbing's Greyhound Bus Museum. Greyhound buses ultimately linked Minnesota with the rest of the country. But it was a giant body of water on Minnesota's eastern border that would connect the state with the world, giving rise to one of America's great port cities and the birthplace of an American cultural icon named Bob Dylan. In the late 1600s, a group of French-Canadian explorers crossed Lake Superior and guided their canoes into this inlet at the mouth of Minnesota's Pigeon River. They had heard rumors that this waterway would lead them to rich hunting grounds for beaver. But as they paddled upstream, a formidable obstacle towered above them. The rapids roared beneath these menacing falls. Plunging 120 feet, they're the highest in Minnesota. Luckily for the traders, they weren't the first to face this navigational dilemma. Near the falls, hidden beneath the trees, lay a trade route of the local Ojibwe people, who had long used it to carry their canoes around the falls. Safely upstream, they could paddle on to rich inland hunting grounds. Both the Ojibwe and French names for the trail mean a great carrying place. Today, it's known as Grand Portage and lies near the U.S.-Canadian border. Thanks to Grand Portage, the beaver trade flourished. So in 1794, the Montreal-based Northwest Company set up a trading post nearby on the Lake Superior shoreline. In the bay, they built over 70 canoes each year for their travel upriver. A reconstruction of their Great Hall is now the centerpiece of Grand Portage National Monument, which celebrates the historic fur trade and Ojibwe culture. The adventurous fur traders who paddled up Minnesota's rivers may be long gone, but explorers continue to navigate these northern waterways. They journey here to experience one of Minnesota's greatest riches: the pristine wilderness of an area known as the Boundary Waters. It covers 1 million acres of lakes, streams, and forests, stretching across northern Minnesota to the Canadian border. With more than 1,000 lakes, the Boundary Waters can seem like an impenetrable landscape from high above. But this aquatic wilderness is a playground for those who love to paddle. And archaeologists recently unearthed siltstone tools here, suggesting that humans inhabited these shores as early as 10,000 years ago, soon after Ice Age glaciers carved out the lakes. The view today is much like Minnesota's early inhabitants would have found it. But not all waters in Minnesota are as peaceful as these. Due east of these placid lakes, Lake Superior provides a stark contrast. Like a vast ocean, the 33,000 square mile surface of this Great Lake provides the perfect opportunity for northeastern storms to pick up steam before hitting Minnesota's coast, earning this area of the North Shore the title, the most dangerous piece of water in the world. In the last half of the 19th century, the coastline of this Great Lake has been a graveyard for freight steamers. The jagged cliffs around Split Rock Lighthouse have been particularly cruel. On November 28, 1905, hurricane-force winds threw a ship called the Madeira straight into the rocks just north of where the lighthouse now stands. Once aground, a member of the crew leapt from the ship and scrambled up the 60-foot cliff face. Slinging a rope out to his crew, he managed to save all but one. After the storm cleared, construction began on the Split Rock Lighthouse. At the time, it was one of the most remote lighthouses ever built. During the 1905 storm, 29 freighters were either damaged or destroyed along this coast. One of the deadliest wrecks happened right outside of Duluth, Lake Superior's largest port. In the early 20th century, steel freighters were fixtures on the horizon here. Unlike any other U.S. port, Duluth had access to both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Trains brought Minnesota's mineral bounty to Duluth, and Duluth shipped it to the rest of the world. During World War II, crews on these ore docks loaded as much as 400,000 tons a day onto ships heading for the iron and steel works of Chicago and Pittsburgh. They all passed underneath Duluth's most iconic landmark, the aerial lift bridge. It was constructed in 1905 to connect the long spit of land known as Minnesota Point to the rest of the city, but not interfere with its busy shipping lane. Today, Duluth's shipping business has slowed, but the bridge still rises up to 40 times a day for all ships, big and small. This gritty landscape made a powerful impression on one Duluth resident, born here in the 1940s. I like the way the hills tumble to the waterfront and the way the wind blows around the grain elevators. The train yards go on forever, too. It's old age industrial. That's what it is. Those are the words of one of America's greatest cultural icons. A Minnesota boy named Bob Zimmerman, who grew up in Duluth's Hillside District and went on to become the musical genius known as Bob Dylan. He was born at St. Mary's Hospital in 1941, and for the first 6 years of his life, lived in the second-story flat of this now green-roofed clapboard house. At the age of 4, he was already filling the house with music, and later sang at family gatherings. In 1959, when he was 17, he went to see rock legend Buddy Holly perform here at the historic Duluth Armory. It was one of Holly's final performances, just 3 days before he died in a plane crash in Iowa. In the packed auditorium, the 17-year-old Zimmerman was right in the front row. That night would prove to be a key inspiration for his career. Not long after the Armory show, Bob was on to the big city of Minneapolis. His time here transformed him. After enrolling at the University of Minnesota, he moved into the student neighborhood known as Dinkytown. It was a mix of students and counterculture types, a little piece of Greenwich Village in the Midwest. He rented a small apartment above this former corner drugstore, and while he attended a few classes, music consumed him. A local beatnik poet lent Bob a copy of Woody Guthrie's autobiography, and he was surrounded by American folk music, which was coming back into vogue. Something clicked. He traded in his electric guitar for an acoustic one and began singing in coffee houses under the new stage name, Bob Dylan. "You call yourself what you want to call yourself," he later said. "This is the land of the free." It's rumored that one of Dylan's greatest songs, All Along the Watchtower, was inspired by this hat-shaped building called the Witch's Tower on the University of Minnesota campus. Like a medieval turret, this water tower lords over Prospect Park, which made it easy to spot from Dylan's apartment. In Minneapolis, while Dylan was finding inspiration from the music of generations past, the city itself was becoming one of the more forward-thinking places in the Midwest. some of its progressive roots can be found at Dylan's alma mater. The University of Minnesota was one of the first co-ed public universities in the country. And ever since it was founded in 1869, its students have been thinking outside of the box. U of M graduates have dreamt up such revolutionary products as Gore-Tex, Post-its, and rollerblades. But despite being on the cutting edge, one age-old tradition here holds fast: football. This 50,000-seat stadium known as Gopher Hole is the beloved home of the Golden Gophers, one of the oldest college football teams in the country, with one of the most storied rivalries. Since 1890, they've battled the University of Wisconsin Badgers 122 times, vying for hometown glory and claim to the 6-foot Paul Bunyan axe. Lately, the Badgers have been the ones chopping down the goalpost post-game, a winner's tradition. Much like Paul Bunyan himself, this mythic rivalry will never die. Minnesota is a land of many legends, from its sports teams to its Fortune 500 companies. But Minnesotans are particularly proud of their local music heroes. Dylan was the king of folk music in the 1960s. But 20 years later, a young musician from Minneapolis named Prince appeared on the scene and revolutionized pop music. In a quiet suburb of Minneapolis, this 65,000-square-foot fortress is the stage for one of the most outrageous showmen in pop history. Prince Rogers Nelson, better known simply as Prince, was born in Minneapolis in 1958. And by the age of 24, already had an album that had gone platinum. Following the runaway success of Purple Rain, Prince built Paisley Park Studios. Beneath its glass skylights are a soundstage, rehearsal hall, and multiple recording studios, where he masterminded a new genre of music: the industrial synthesizer-infused Minneapolis sound. Here in the Twin Cities, Purple Pride is fierce. When 64,000 fans pack the Vikings Metrodome, it's guaranteed to be a raucous evening. In fact, it's known as one of the loudest stadiums in the NFL. But this one state-of-the-art dome is over 30 years old, and like many NFL players, it's looking at retirement. Now, an even bigger $975 million stadium is in the works. But pro sports fans in Minneapolis have plenty to keep them entertained while they wait. Their legendary Minnesota Twins have one of the best new ballparks in the country. It also happens to be one of the greenest. Here at Target Field, rainwater is collected under the grass, and steam-powered electricity is generated at the trash incinerator next door. Just a few blocks away, its sister stadium, Target Center, boasts one of the largest living roofs in the state. It covers the ball courts of the NBA's Minnesota Timberwolves, keeping the team and its fans warm during even the coldest of the state's notorious harsh winters. Back in 1885, a New York journalist called Minnesota another Siberia, unfit for human habitation. But ice and snow hasn't stopped immigrants from flooding into the state, even those from one of the hottest countries on the planet. This is Little Mogadishu, home of the largest Somali population in North America. Many of those who fled Somalia's former civil war to seek refuge in America now live in this cluster of public housing apartments the Somalis call the Towers. There are more Somalis in Minnesota than in any other state. That's because local volunteers have worked hard to help these refugees adapt to life here. And despite the cold, most choose to stay in Minnesota. Over the years, many immigrants' dreams have become reality in the Twin Cities. The fact is, the quality of life here ranks at the top of the country. It could be that there's something to Minnesota nice after all. Or maybe it has to do with being surrounded by so much water. The name Minneapolis means Water City, thanks to the 22 lakes that sit within its limits. Here on the largest, Lake Minnetonka, locals can enjoy the great outdoors without even leaving town. Only from above does the true scope of Minnesota's bounty come into focus. From the farmers who inspired a great American storyteller, to the lumberjacks and miners who power the nation's big industries, to the adventurers and innovators who still keep the pioneering spirit of the state's early explorers ablaze.